So close.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Fritz Anderson. I am apparently a historian, I heard in my bio. I am a researcher who enjoys studying Native culture. 2 years ago, it was a COVID deal. I started studying Native soldiers from the Civil War who happened to be from Minnesota. And there were a lot of them. I was surprised. That turned into the Mentee, and the Mentee has been a fascination ever since. So that's me talking to you about the Mentee. I would say bonjour, bonjour, and bonsoir. Those are, of course, French. The second one is Ojibwe, and the third is Metis, which is the language of the Mentee. All those greetings are greetings that you would hear from Mentee peoples. They were multilingual, typically, and comfortable going from one to the next. I don't know if does anybody ever even remember the one day in 5th grade when we learned about the ox carts coming down in Minnesota? Attaboy, thank you. I envisioned that one day and remember it because I'm an extreme history nerd. And all I can recall is they were carts, I think cows were pulling them, and there was some maps that showed some cool trails coming down. That's the extent of my knowledge. What I want to talk to you about tonight is the rest of the story, as they say, for the oldsters in the room, know what I'm talking about. The rest of the story is not the Red River carts, it is the people, the Mentee. An astonishing and exceptionally interesting folk. I need to step back in history a little bit to give you an idea of what and how the Mentee came to be. The word Mentee with a lowercase m represents people of mixed ancestry. It's a French word. The sons of the fur trade are the Mentee, the children of fur traders. The French came to America in the 1600s and began to develop a fur trade shortly thereafter. Soon, fur traders were going out to different areas as far as Minnesota and out into the Dakotas. And one way that you could become a better connected person with the tribe or band that you're working with would be to marry a woman from within that band. Flip side, the chief or the higher end person in that particular band would also want to build what they call not like relationship, but more relative. Everybody who is a member of the band and their in-laws and everyone else is a relation. And that was an overwhelming part of Native society throughout the country. So if you had a relative, you had an obligation to feed them, give them clothes, and kill for them. You might have to fight another tribe. So from the chief's point of view, marrying his daughter to a fur trader was a value add because of that person has an obligation now to treat me differently than others, all the other fur traders. He's a relation. A relation is different than relative. A relation is big picture. Also, you're going to get an in with them, if you're a native guy. You're going to have a better, hopefully a better deal selling your furs. And from the Frenchmen, in this case, fur traders' point of view, you now have an in with that band, possibly that tribe. And most importantly, you now have a wife who realizes her importance and teaches you to speak very well in the language, to understand the culture of this tribe and tribes around them. So folks often jump on board the train of, well, the white man came and took away the European man came and took away the daughter of the tribe. It was very much all three pleased with the situation, generally. Not many, I don't know if anybody's ever heard about Maiden Rock before, down in Mississippi where a Dakota girl jumped off. Princess. They didn't really have any princesses, but that's okay. At any rate, there weren't a lot of Maiden Rock jumpers amongst the ones that were married to the fur trade. So that group of people, those husband and wives throughout all the bands of all North America, developed a new class of people that were really good at the fur trade because they knew the native side of things because they grew up there, and they knew the white side of things because a lot of times they went and spent time with that side of the family. So they were at an advantage over others. Now, not too far along in the history of North America, history guys talk like this. Only about 100 years later, the French got into a war with the English, and the French lost. So they lost their lands in what would become Canada and in North America, United States later. So the English came in and took over the fur trade, and the English were very British. They didn't think much about having their fur traders have country wives, is what it was called when you went out into the field. They felt that that's the wrong thing to do, and the Mentee and the French people that were already there trading, they were some kind of lesser than quality people. So a huge corporation was formed called the Hudson Bay Company. Hudson Bay Company owned everything west of Ontario to the ocean. They had power, the most powerful corporation ever. They had the right to call in the army. If they didn't like what was going on, they could say, send over a couple hundred troops. We need some putting down of people. So the HBC, I'm going to call it that from now on because it's long in the tongue. The HBC were also run by well-to-do men living in London. And they didn't much care for the way things had been done under the French. So they didn't think much of the people. The HBC would have contracts they would form were workers, and the workers would pick, not pick, they would be assigned 2, 3, 5 years that they may be stuck doing this job with no out. They were voyageurs, they were interpreters, they were clerks, they were whatever. They were people that worked for the HBC. And once you worked for the man, as I call him, you couldn't get away. And if you did leave, you were breaking the law and you were called a deserter if you ran away from the HBC. Well, I can tell you this much. These are Mentee. They're kind of like halfway clothing-wise between what Europeans would wear and what Native folks would wear. This was actually, I know I'm getting ahead, but this was actually painted by a guy who came over under this cockamamie scheme that a fellow came up with called Selkirk land. And he painted this as a 15-year-old kid from Switzerland. They lasted 5 months before they moved. I'll tell more about that later, but just with this particular slide. Back to the HBC. The people that were children of the fur trade, remember that terminology? Children of the fur trade were the folks that were the Mentee, looked down upon by the HBC, and so they look at things in a different way. They've been raised by their tribe, and they didn't see a way that they could live under a way of signing up for a 5-year contract, eating bad food the whole time, and doing extremely difficult labor. They were, the HBC called them freedmen, and they said it derogatorily, and they took it as their name, as the freedmen. They didn't want to have anything to do, so they became their own fur traders. They developed small companies and went out and did it on their own. The Mentee went everywhere, all over the place, further west, became very good at what they did. But eventually there became a group that gravitated up to the Red River country, which is northwest Minnesota, northeast North Dakota, and southern Manitoba. Probably you guys know this, but I didn't before this. The Red River is one of the few rivers that goes north rather than south. So they went and formed a European life. So they were able to form their own society within a vacuum. There was nobody on the outside pushing in, or at least not that much, just the HBC, and that was the man, and everybody hated them, and it was like this. So they were good. But what I haven't seen anywhere else in Western history is groups of people that were disparate Europeans and natives became an entirely new society. There were the French, there were the Scots, there were a few English and Irish, and then there were these crazy guys who I kind of identify with because my name's Anderson, called the Orcadians. They came from the Orkney Islands, and the Orkney Islands had been part of Sweden forever, and then the last 100 years before this happened, Scotland took it over. So they were, the HBC called these guys who they brought over, the Orcadians, as their Vikings. And my name's Anderson, and there were lots of Andersons on that list. So they tossed in a few Vikings in there. And then the Cree First Nation tribe, the Ojibwe, were their cousins and speak a similar language. And a band that we've never heard of hardly in Minnesota called, and I had never heard of them, and I am a guy who studies it, a Shinnemoy, a large tribe. Actually, they started in southern Minnesota, but at this time, they were up in the Red River country. And they were at the Yankton, and I'm going to call them Sioux because it's really tough to not do it and not be able to identify it. But the Yankton Sioux were a gigantic band or tribe within the Siouxian culture. Two guys got in a fight over a girl. Imagine that. One killed the other, brother killed the brothers, brothers killed the brothers, relations killed the relations, and half of the tribe went north and half of them stayed there. So the Yanktons are over there in South Dakota, and these guys are up in northern North Dakota. So they speak Lakota or Dakota. But they are part of, and since their enemies were the Yanktons, they became friends with the Cree and with the Ojibwe. And so they were part of this group as well. What was amazing about this society is that they took the best of both worlds. Amongst the native peoples, they took that sense of relations, something that we don't typically see in our world, especially these days. But everybody that was a Metis, you owed allegiance to. Whether they were, grandpa was a Cree or grandma was a French, or didn't matter. All of them were Metis. So that sense of relations, the ability to hunt, stealthiness, knowing the right food to eat on the prairie, all the things that native culture could bring. From the European side, entrepreneurs. They were entrepreneurs extraordinaire. Something not typically known for in native culture. And just, it wasn't part of their world. They were more of a, everybody did for everybody. So that, and also their amazing sense of fun. They loved to wear colorful clothes, this kind of thing. This would be low, nothing fancy for these guys. They loved to sing. They would, the whole time they'd be on the cart from Canada down to St. Paul, they'd sing old French songs the whole way. Half of them didn't know what the words meant, but they sang them anyways. As they're going this fast, walking next to a cow, oxen. They're not real fast. Anyways, that's an aside. Also, the flamboyance and general sense of loving life. And this group of people came together, and people that saw them, that were Westerners, that were Europeans, were taken aback. This is back when, you ever see the pictures where everybody's got a grayish, dark clothes on, and they all look like this, which they had to, but they got the bonnets on, and people didn't dress up. They didn't wear bright colors. And these guys wore plenty bright colors. I like what, I'm going to tell something here, but these people, and they say it better, folks that are among the Metis say it better, they were neither European nor native, but something entirely new that was entirely different. An unusual circumstance in the world. There's an author by the name of John Tilley, who much more eloquently than me described the Mentee. I just wanted to show you a picture of what the folks look like. The Mentee nation didn't just drift slowly into the North American consciousness in the early 1800s. It burst onto the scene fully formed. The Mentee people were flamboyant, defiant, loud, and definitely not noble savages. Nomads always on the move, they were passionate and fierce, visionaries and romantics with big dreams. I love that one. It just, and all the different things that I read about these people, it just makes me want to hang out with them. You know, they're just people that you would love. What I find to be interesting, and also that is talked about from outsiders, not from within that I ever heard of, is that some people, looks like they came straight from the Orkney Islands. There's Jerry Anderson, Fritz Anderson right there with his blonde beard, and native people who looked like they were native people. So nobody cared. It was a thing in human existence that I've never seen before, where it didn't matter what you looked like, you were a Mentee. That's what mattered. And you were a relation. So if somebody tries to kill you, you got about 6,000 people to back you up. Kind of like I'm the youngest of 5 boys. Somebody messes with Fritz, he's got 4 backups. They're in trouble. Small town America back in the day. So during this time period, the Mentee were flourishing. They were doing this, the Hudson Bay Company, and living as free men. And all of a sudden, around 1812, a fellow by the name of Douglas, Earl of Selkirk, decided he was going to buy up the majority stock in the Hudson Bay Company. Then he decided, why don't we start a new colony out in the middle of North Dakota, way northern Minnesota, and southern Manitoba, with a bunch of Scottish fellas who, coincidentally, Selkirk owned a bunch of these farms, were getting kicked off their farm because they were small renters who used to raise sheep, and they figured out that it was much more cost effective to have great big farms. Imagine that. Great big farms, and all these small farmers were kicked off their farms. So Selkirk thought it was a fine idea to take people who knew how to raise and shear sheep. They lived in a place where there's hardly any farming that took place because it's northern Scotland. And although it's cold and chilly in Scotland, it's not Grand Forks, North Dakota cold in January, right? These poor people came over here ill-prepared after an extremely long voyage, having gone through the Arctic, because they had to come up the Red River Valley to get there, from the top side, all the way down to about 50 miles north of what became the American border. The area which is north of Pembina, North Dakota, where the Mentee were largely living at that time. They didn't have enough food, they didn't have the right clothes, and they had no shelter. And they brought them in July. Too late to plant anything. They had an interesting thing that I noticed here. See that? That's the 49th parallel. That's what would become the United States. So this land called Assiniboia, which I can't spit out, so I call it Selkirk land, and would go all the way from North Dakota to Lake Superior, and as far south as south of the Red Lakes. So it was an enormous chunk of land. These poor Scottish guys, you know, winter came, they were all starving, they were all freezing, and they came down and the Mentee helped them. They were generally a kind-hearted people, and they helped them survive. They gave them clothing and a place to live. After that, in the spring, they went back north. Being Highlanders from Scotland, they didn't know any better, so they went out and chopped down the only area of trees that were sugar maples. If you want to piss off some native people, you chop down all the sugar maples. That's their one source besides honey where they get anything sweet. So the local native folks and the Mentee were very unhappy with them, and life didn't get better. They had repeated times where there were grasshopper problems and floods, and they didn't do well. Some assimilated into the Mentee, but generally they didn't do very well. And this is jumping forward a ways, but Sibley, who was the first governor and general in the Dakota War, came to Minnesota in the 1830s to be a fur trader. He was American, so he was kind of the early on Americans as far as that goes to coming. He was a young man who loved to hunt. He'd go out and go on massive hunts with a fellow by the name of Jack Frazier, who was a Kit Carson in the Northwest, and he would also go up and hunt with the Metis on one of their buffalo hunts. And his general opinion of the Metis was very high, as were most European people at that time period in the 1830s. They were living a hard life, all of them, and they could appreciate people who could live that hard life and do better than they could. In the northern part of Minnesota, on both sides of the line dividing the United States from the British possessions, remember this is not my words, there is to be found a large population consisting mostly of mixed bloods. These men possess in an eminent degree the physical energy and power of endurance of the white man, combined with the activity, subtlety, and skill in hunting of the Indian. They are fine horsemen and remarkably dexterous in the chase of the buffalo. Half farmer and half hunter, they till the ground and they raise fine crops of wheat and other cereals, while semi-annually they repair to the buffalo region to procure meat, which they cure in diverse ways and dispose of to our own citizens and to the Hudson Bay Company for the supply of their remote inland trading routes. So Sibley thought a fair amount of them. The ox cart trade developed slowly. There were a few came down when Fort Snelling opened up around 1822. They allowed some of those refugees from up in the Red River Valley to settle around the fort. And I can tell you this much, there were at least 6 men who were very pleased that they let a Swiss person come. By the way, they had recruited amongst the Swiss and brought over mechanics and watchmakers to work to become farmers up there. So they didn't do well, along with that kid who was the artist. So they came down to Fort Snelling. The Mentee came along as guides and to protect them. And the Mentee figured out this is kind of a good gig down here. There's going to be people that want to buy our stuff here, and we're not going to be controlled by the Hudson Bay Company, who has one price for buffalo hides. And that's what the price is. No matter how good they are or how many you provide, that's the price. So they began to trickle down more and more. Some came here to settle, and some came here to become part of the ox cart trade. Eventually that turned into an enormous number of people who came down, where they would have upwards of 200 and 300 carts in one train that would come down. Here's an example of some folks that are looking like they're going out to do the hunt for the buffalo because they have covers on and they're a place to stay. Here it is. That elusive one thing you remember from 5th grade. Remember about the ox cart? There were trails. They formed trails. The Western Trail went through the prairie and also to the Yankton Sioux land, who were mad at them and liked to have an occasional battle. So while it was a nice flat way to get there, it was not all that good for having to fight off the Dakota Lakotas. A second trail was started in an attempt to steer clear of them. They were still too close. It was still a problem. So eventually they broke down and did the Northern Trail, which was through heavy woods, where they'd have to, the trail would be like this. Or one year there'd be a swamp there and one year it'd be dry. So it was tough territory, but the Ojibwe were their relations. So they weren't getting killed. Plus, the way that carts were built, it was nice to have backup chunks of trees hanging around. This is my favorite one. When I was living down on 7th and Jackson Street in an apartment, I began studying the Metis. I was looking at this picture. They said, this is on Jackson Street, a few blocks up from the wharf. I lived a few blocks up from the Mississippi at that time on Jackson Street. I'm looking out the window going, right there. They were right there. All these carts, zillions of them came down there. So you'll notice also these fellas standing in the background. The merchants came to realize that enormous numbers of Mentee coming down and selling their product now had a whole lot of cash in their hands and need for hardware, groceries, maybe a canooper down at the bar, or whatever they needed. That part of Minnesota and St. Paul history is so very important because these people that started these places were by and large the ones who started our state. So they were catering to the Mentee who were coming down from the ox cart trade. I like this one. That's the Mississippi right there, and that is St. Anthony. If you notice right, it's hard to see, but there's only one guy in here who's actually riding one of these carts. They would hook them all up together and pull 12 or 15 in a row. I love this man right there. This is on a place called Lake Larper, which is no longer there. It was at Dale in '94 where they come together. There was a great big meadow where all of them would congregate either before or after they sold their product, and they would reacquaint themselves with their relations and their friends and all their buddies and had a good time down in the cities because they lived a pretty rustic lifestyle. The cart itself, there it is. Check out the what the parts are made out of. They're basically sticks. And even the wheel itself, they said it was circular, kind of. So it'd be ka-thump, ka-thump, And what's really amazing is the Mentee invented this cart. Looks like a lot of other carts, but there's not a single metal part in it. It is all wood and sinew, part of an animal's muscle. So it all was held together by a little bit of sinew, and the hub is where the axle would go underneath. The axle looked a lot like those sticks right there. They were small saplings a lot of times. The biggest part you'll ever hear about, if you ever read about the Mentee from the time period, from Western or from people who were Europeans, is how loud they were, because they couldn't use grease on these, because otherwise those little saplings that were the axle were out like that, because that grease would pick up sand and other detritus stuff and ruin them quickly. And part of the beauty of this cart is if a part broke, you walk over to the woods and grab a new one. Which is why the whole plains part didn't work very well either. So they had an amazing product that they had built, and they built thousands of them. They cost about $15 a piece. The tires, the wheels, they're a little bit concave coming out from the hub, because they could take them off, put them on the bottom of the cart, and it would float. Because they had to cross the Red River and all the other rivers between here and there. Here's my favorite painting. These are the Mentee. A gentleman by the name of Paul came to the Northwest, it was called then, and went from Indian tribe to Indian tribe, native tribe to native tribe, and painted paintings like this one. This one was rather amazing because it's one of the few I've seen of a painting of the actual hunt. And the hunt was an amazing thing. What I think is particularly funny is this guy laying on the ground, that's the artist. Artists have a sense of humor. However, not just a sense of humor, they're barreling along as fast as they can on a horse, 18 miles an hour roughly. He flies off, and a whole bunch of 1,000-pound buffalo are coming right at him. 3 of his Mentee guys that were his watching out for him formed up 3 horses, hoof or nose to tail, and made the buffalo go around. So this guy was pretty happy with the people that took him on. And he painted a really nice painting. I like the detail. This particular guy, he was of Scottish ancestry somewhere. He had a tam on his head. One guy's got Native American looking more. He's got some feathers in. Let's just scoot by this one, because basically what this part says is that there were lots of rules and regulations. Because of the nature of the hunt and how many people went out on one, you had to have something organized. And the captains would be elected, and then they were in charge. And if you messed up, your clothes got cut up, your bridle got cut up, or you got flogged. You have to remember that there were, in these hunting groups, there were upwards of 1,000 or more people, men, women, and children. This is what I call, this particular painting I call the factory. The Mentee developed a system to make a product called pemmican. You would go out and hunt buffalo. You would shoot the cows primarily because they had more fat in them and better quality meat. They would harvest, your average cow is 900 pounds. The guys who were in charge of, or the women or men that were in charge of Following up to butcher the cows would come and do so. So everybody had their job down to the smallest child. The meat would be processed, it would be dried, and then pounded into a powdery substance. An entire buffalo represented 50 pounds of that powdery substance. It was then put in a tray that was made of buffalo hide, and they would then heat up the fat, the tallow, and pour it in that tray. They would then cover it with another buffalo hide and sew it shut and let it dry. If kept dry, it had an almost indefinite time period that you could still eat it. It also, somebody did a study on it somewhere along the way, an extra size brownie, big brownie, that size of a chunk of pemmican was 2,000 calories of pure protein. So it weighed about 8-9 ounces. So if you're out trotting around, let's say you're Lewis and Clark, there's no deer around to shoot, and you have the option of bringing along a bunch of great big barrels of flour that are going to be a pain in the keister to make anything out of, or you can buy pemmican that, this will keep you alive, might not taste good, I don't know, I've never tasted it, but it's lightweight, and they sold enormous amounts of it. So one cow, between the meat and the fat, represented one of those, they call them bales. They were about 100 pounds. They would be able to put 10 of those bales on a cart, and they sold them for a pretty good price. But that being said, each cart could carry the equivalent of 10 buffalo. You think about it, it's just like, okay, I can't imagine 10 buffalo on there, but rendered down, that's what it was. Their favorite people, the Hudson Bay Company, needed a lot of pemmican because they had people all over Canada and up into the northern United States that were working for them. Every year, they needed 12,000 tons of pemmican, which represents 24,000 buffalo. And that's just the HBC. That's just one side of things. That's not counting all of it that they sold down here at Fort Snelling, and Lewis and Clark literally bought some, by the way, and other groups that were out going that direction. I'm going to quickly just show you at first, when I started reading these things, I had a difficult time believing the volume of what they did. This one says they numbered 154 families, including 210 men able to carry arms, of which 169 were buffalo runners. Buffalo runners were the ones we got to shoot. And 700 non-combatants, women and children. They took with them 642 horses, 50 oxen, 6 cows, 522 dogs. Who kept track of the dogs? I don't know. 533 carts, 1 wagon, 233 guns, 10 revolvers, 21,000 bullets, and 270 quarts of powder. They made 12 runs, which would mean that they went after the buffalo 12 times. And they got 3,270 buffalo in one spring or fall hunt. Produced way too many bulls in there, apparently, because this was in 1870 from a newspaper that was written in the Northwest, out in what's now Edmonton. So there was too many bulls, but I suspect that by this time, there were getting to be less buffalo, period. This was 1860. And that would explain why they have so much dried meat, too. They didn't make the bulls into pemmican. but they did have 15,120 pounds of marrow fat. Woo, delish. The hunt itself was just crazy, crazy. Those 169 guys that we just talked about in there, they would have horses that were just used for the runs, for the times when they were chasing the buffalo. They were never used for anything else. They were trained within an inch of their lives because they would put 6 balls of lead in their mouth before they hopped on the on the horse, have a loaded gun, come up, shoot one. Then they would take their powder, fill it, take the barrel like this fellow is right here. I couldn't believe there's painting in this, by the way. And spit the bullet down the barrel.
Safety
and then
first.
tamp it down on his horse's saddle. Now, this is when you're in the middle of 10,000 buffalo riding full bent for election on a horse, and you're allowing your horse to go wherever it goes because it's so well trained that you know you're not going to die. And you're letting him, you're also leading him around by your legs. He's been trained so well that you can trust them to not kill you. And you're going to go along and kill 7 bison, buffalo. And I think a priest wrote this and said in the course of an acre, which is not very far, they would sometimes kill 3 cows. And so you got a big yard, think about chasing at full speed, reloading your gun on a full run, fast horse, and you're going to shoot 3 of them within an acre. They were amazing people, and they had so much fun. Just a real quick thing I want to read you from Father Belcourt, who was, these people were primarily Catholic, and the priest figured out pretty quick that if they're going to have 2 hunts a year that are 6 weeks long, you better go out with them or you're going to miss out on some of the stuff. And plus, you know, might be a good opportunity for some prayers, a little extra in the plate. Father Belcourt says, each man sprang to his saddle, crying out, "Cows, cows, la vache, la vache," expecting we'd find ourselves in close proximity to the animals, which had been announced with so much assurance, but to my surprise, I could perceive none. At length, I was made to remark, several miles away, certain objects which, as there was a mirage, appeared to me to be trees. But even at that distance, the keen eye of the hunters recognized them to be not trees, nor even bulls, but cows. And he went on to say, and this made me smile because I feel like I've gotten to know these people through studying them. Even the horses seemed to partake of the joy and ardor of their masters. To moderate the fierceness of the steed was difficult. To restrain that of the hunters was even more so. That guy, crazy. I want to talk to you about some Metis that came to Washington County. There were 2 families, the Turpins and the Belcourts, not Belcourts, Turpins and the Brunels, not like I haven't studied them 8 million times, who shared a part of their world that the men were both of French Canadian ancestry, and the women were both of mixed Mentee native ancestry. They were all over in the fur trade and did a number of different things, but by the time they came down to the Twin Cities area, Fort Snelling area, this county, they were respectable families who owned farmland and did pretty well. The old Louis Grinnell and Joe Turpin got to be friends. I don't know if they were friends before, but their families grew together and formed bonds. Between the Turpins and the Grinnells, they had 22 kids. Not unusual at the time. In 1850 and prior to the Civil War, both the Grinnells and the Turpins were by and large fitting in with the American dream. They owned land, they had all the good things that come with that. Families, church going, all those good things. In 1844, the two families came together. Francis Turpin, Francois Xavier Turpin, married Marie. Don't listen to these guys if they shout anything at me, because they know more than I do about these families, the Seversons. They're the Great Cloud Island experts of all things Metis. And the two married, Marie Grinnell and Francois, in 1844. Francois was already doing pretty good. When he was 2 years prior to this, he got himself at age 16 a liquor license. I don't know if they had a legal drinking age then, but apparently not any problem with the liquor license. Often when people were from out of town, they said every house in St. Paul is also a pub. Because when the people would come down, it was time to make some cash on the Red River folk. So the Francis and Marie, I use that interchangeably because he went by Francis and Francois. And Marie had two farms, not just one, two farms in 1860. One down here and one up in Centerville. An interesting little aside. Apparently, no one told people from other countries that if you happened to be in two different places, don't sign up for the census both times. I found it like 20 times. They were almost all French Mentee background folk. And that's what Francis, that's the reason I knew that, because Francis was on the census in 1860 at both farms. By that point, they were angling in on their 10th child, and they were doing quite well. Obviously, they had two farms. In 1861, the world changed. Civil War began, and both the Grinnells and the Turpins and their extended clan signed up. There were at least 20 amongst all of their kin who became soldiers in the Civil War. Why? They were new to this country. They had a legal exemption. They couldn't be drafted because they were part native. They fought for the same reason all the other Americans fought. And lo and behold, old Francis, and I mean old, 36, 37 years old, 1862, decides, well, I should join up too. So he and his brother, Sevier, and Joseph all joined the 5th Minnesota. And then a whole slug of different Turpins and Rouleaus and all kinds of people that are related to this family joined. Unfortunately, a grandson of old Louis Grinnell, his name was Rouleau, and his first name was Joe Rouleau. Like it wouldn't be Joe in that. Old Joe, that's an inside joke. Everybody had 8,000 Joes and they had a French last name. But old Joe, unfortunately, had just joined the 6th Minnesota. They was sent down to fight the Dakota. And at Birch Coulee, he was killed. Some say that he could speak Dakota. And in that battle, the Dakota had many that were also of mixed ancestry fighting on the other side. And they said in Dakota to these mixed bloods or half-breeds, they call them, said, hey, half-breeds, come out. We won't shoot you, because it was overwhelming odds in that particular battle to expect that everybody would get killed. None of them did. We know for sure. We have done the research on poor old Boyer. He got a bad rap for being a Zerg. He wasn't. But anyways, Rouleau was killed, and several of the Brunel kids and grandkids died of sickness, which is pretty common, that it's 2 or 3 to 1 of sickness versus being killed and died in the Civil War. So the Brunels took the brunt of what happened in the Civil War, whereas the Turpins, I don't think, had any that were killed in the war. I knew they were coming today, and I was like, oh no.
Good thing you sat in front.
Yeah. So, but they did have one young boy, Amabe, youngest son of Francis, who joined the cavalry at age 14. He survived the war, came home, and I don't know this for fact, but many came home with sicknesses, especially tuberculosis. When you were put in together like that in a tight space, it became rampant. And poor little Amabe lasted 2 more years and died of sickness, and is buried at a little place in Rice County called the St. Louis French Catholic Cemetery, where, here's my little commercial, next summer on July 30th, an organization that I run called Native Vets Remembered will be installing a new stone for a person who's buried there without one, who is of Native ancestry and who served in the Civil War. July 30th. If you're curious, let me know. At any rate, by a strange circumstance, his mother then died only 6-8 years later, and was living out there at that time and was buried in the same place as their son. Amabe, or Amabe, nobody knew who Amabe was until we figured it out. Amabe was a Turpin, but everybody who spoke English as their primary language thought Turpin sounded like Chuck, the T in Turpin. So they named him Crispin. And he's buried under that name. And to the best of my knowledge from the Turpin clan, and I know a bunch of them now, nobody knew whatever happened to old Amabe. And it just drove me insane. And we finally figured out that Amabe had the wrong name. The war ended, the veterans came home, and the world was very different than it had been when they left. A respectable family man, Francis was, had 10 children, 2 farms, doing well in the world by anyone's imagination, the American dream. However, he was, in the words of the time, a half-breed. And because of the Dakota War, there was no longer any sense of wanting any half-breeds around. The great diaspora of the Mentee happened shortly thereafter. They went, lots of them went up north to join Ojibwe reservations. Some went west that were part of Dakota. Some just went west to be where the next opportunity is on Montana or somewhere where you can still get away with being a mixed person. And some large group went to an enclave on a little place called Great Cloud Island, where a whole slug of people lived a subsistence life on 10 and 12 acre farms, working as frog catchers or whatever you fill in the bank. They were not at the top of the social ladder. they had done everything for the country, but their country didn't do everything for them. They were constantly being harassed whenever we read pension papers that they were liars and they were half-breeds. And one of the things about being a person of mixed ancestry in that time, if I had a newspaper account about me as a mixed blood person in the newspaper, it would say, Fritz Anderson, a half-breed, saved 13 children from a fire. And then tell me all about the fire where I was the bravest guy in the world, but had to put in there a half-breed. Every newspaper we ever read, that's the way it is. Sadly, there wasn't a whole lot of appreciation for what they had done, and they continued on, and their blood flows throughout, according to Ancestry at least, where I'm trying to find people who are Hercules LaChapelle's descendants. There's plenty of them around. So they've done okay. I don't want to be such a downer about that, but it was kind of an unfair situation. And a person that was of mixed ancestry came home and said to a newspaper that I read, "We are the remnants of another age." It stuck with me. Those were pretty wise words. I have done, as I said earlier, a search of all of the folks that I could find so far that are Native soldiers who served in the Civil War. So far, about 325, believe it or not. Of that 325, close to 100 were Red River Métis. This gentleman in the front row, sitting down, that's Francis. Supposedly, this is 1 year after the war. So he would have been 42, 43. I mean, I've been gray-haired since I was 11, but I didn't look quite as tough as old Francis there. Yeah. And that's his son, Frank. And the Seversons are going to smile at me because I think this is Paul Brunel. There's another picture of a Brunel, and I think there's a similarity. These two, Paul and Frank, if that is indeed Paul, would have served in the Civil War together, and it would make sense. And ZZ Top down here, I don't know who he is. He's probably somebody in the family, but I don't have any idea who it is. This is Mentee for thank you. See? Barak. Merci. Either with everyone or individually, whatever you choose. Yes,
You
ma'am.
didn't tell us much about the women in the Metis tribe. What were the lives of the women like?
The lives of the women were very similar to the lives of the men. They were integral parts of the buffalo hunt factory, I call it. They were, to a certain degree, thought of as the leaders of the household. Everything that was inside of their place they lived, including the place they lived, belonged to the wife. Husband didn't have title. So it was a matrilineal society. And thank you for pointing that out to me, that I haven't brought that up enough, and I will in the future, because the women that were Mentee were strong. And those men were out having a good time wearing their fancy clothes, and they were doing the real work. So the Mentee women but they were in that society, matrilineal society, that were judged to be, the women were the legal heir to the land and to the house and all the stuff in it. Not all that unusual for Europeans, is it? But not all, it's not unusual amongst native tribes.
We had a question on the chat regarding the Washington County families and the last name Riel. I may be mispronouncing that, R-I-E-L. They want to know if that is Riel's in the rebellion.
Louis
So-
Riel's?
Yes.
Louis Riel had a rebellion up in the Red River country against the Canadian government. First rebellion was in the 1870s, and the second was, I think, 1882. I don't think that these folks, because they had already established themselves down here for a generation or two, probably had much to do with Louis Riel's revolution that they attempted to have. Louis was the one person who, for that revolution, by the way, who was hung. And he didn't have to be. He wouldn't back down and say he was insane. Yes, sir.
In regard to the word half-breed, use the derogatory term, I was wondering what the word that we use, and if it is derogatory in the old days or now, or both. And that's the word for the female Native American squaw.
Very negative. There are lakes that were called Squaw Lake that have been changed. Yeah, there you go. And it had a negative connotation.
Even in the old days.
You know, it never was said in a real positive way, put it that way. I've never read anywhere. It was kind of like Fritz Anderson, he's a half-breed. Kind of the same deal with a squaw.
Where did the word derive from?
I don't know. I don't know that one. I read it recently and I've forgotten. I've only got so many brain cells.
Something about
Yeah, I read about it recently and there was some sort of relevance to European society that started it, but I don't recall.
the word doesn't sound English. It doesn't sound French either, you know.
Yeah, I don't know.
The French people did the, could you tell us a little bit of history of the French people? Did they come mostly to Canada or did they come to other parts of the United States, and what year did they come?
The original French colonists came in the 1650s, roughly. There were, one of the Turpins that I was talking about was one of the original soldiers that came over to fight the Iroquois and stayed. So there were a lot of the same named families that were the early settlers that represent an enormous number of the people of French Canada. Now, that being said, there were new ones that came along to Canada as they went. And then there were also regular French people that came to the United States. I run across them every once in a while, but I gotta be careful because sometimes they say France on there in the census. I'll go back 10 years and then they were French Canadian, and 10 years before that, oh, they were Mentee. Whatever worked best, you know, truly. But there were French people. Jules Capone, the big Frenchman, who I portray as a Civil War soldier, was from France, and he lived in Wabasha down southeast Minnesota, and came here early in his life, but he was from France, and there were others as well.
A follow-up to the previous question about the rebellion. How do you spell the last name of, I believe the first name was Lewis? Yeah, is it R-I-E-L? Okay. R-I-E-L, okay.
Yep.
Thank you. And I have a question too.
Right.
You had,
I want to thank Emily for inviting me here this evening. I forgot to do that at the beginning, and I'm glad that I thought of it now. Go ahead.
No problem. On one of the slides, you had shown, you know, the population and the breakdown, the demographics, then to women, to dogs, cows. I noticed that there were more dogs than men. Could you just speak to that a little?
I thought it was crazy when I read it for the first time, but why do they keep track of how many dogs they have?
Yeah.
Supposedly the dogs were there to keep the coyotes and wolves away. So they, like everybody, nobody got off scot-free when they were out in the buffalo. They supposedly were there to help defend the village.
I just figured it was because they were riding with guns, and maybe there just were a few of them by that.
Well, and, you know, I don't know. I was gonna say something inappropriate, and I got myself. I'm so proud.
Glad they liked dogs, though.
They were a delicacy within most native tribes. Yes, ma'am.
Well, my husband's family goes back to Metis, and we looked up Metis, and I probably say, I don't say it like you do, but anyway, and the definition came up that it meant the lost tribe, a lost tribe. Have you heard of that?
I have heard that, and it's a romantic notion from what I
Oh.
understand.
Okay. Well, it's on
However,
there.
However, what's interesting is in the United States, we don't believe there's any such thing as the Mentee. I've traveled up to White Earth Reservation to talk with Ojibwe people there that are tribal upper level council people. Then I went over to North Dakota where there's a Ojibwe reservation, and that reservation is all Mentee.
Yeah.
But they all say no.
When we
Ojibwe.
watched the Olympics that were up in Canada, the Metis were represented.
Well, they are a First Nation in Canada, but the American government would not recognize a new society as a First Nation,
That makes sense.
as a tribe.
Sounds
So-
like us.
But they teach their kids Machif in school at Turtle Mountain up there in North Dakota. So I was just going, okay, whatever you guys say, I'm just here to get some nice school information for my book I'm trying to write. So I'm not gonna argue. Yeah, you've been living here a long time. Yes.
I guess it is a follow-up question to that. So, obviously, my dad is a Metis descendant. Are there any like organizations local for people with Metis descendants? Because they kind of cool with that.
I don't know about local, but I belong to the couple of them that are on Facebook, and I've gotten to know people there. And once I get figured life out, I'd like to go up and see some of these folks that are in Canada that live on the reserves. One lady I talked to who was lived on the reserve, about my age, I'm about 60, and she grew up on the reserve and didn't speak any English until she was in 8th grade. They didn't have electricity until she was in 9th grade, and yet she left, went out, got a job, did all the things that you normal people do in the world. But she's telling me this story, and I'm like, it's just my age. How can you do it? They spoke Mentee. But I don't. But on Facebook, there's Red River ancestry groups, and they would be able to probably point you towards an actual group. There's all kinds of pictures online of all these different groups that are out riding in their carts and being, you know, Mentee folk.
Were those carts used by any other groups in the United States or in the new country? Or were they just made by those particular people?
I don't know if any other folks, the question is, were those carts ever used by other groups and cultures? I don't know if others did a copycat of them, but I do know that they used them by and large way the most. Some of their Ojibwe friends use them as well, but I don't know if other groups use them or not. I would assume the HBC, since they were still in existence for a long time after that, probably adopted that at some point in time because they were effective and inexpensive and easy to fix.
Can you see any at a museum anywhere?
I have, actually in Pembina, North Dakota, there's one. And I found one in South Dakota at some guy's place where they make old fashioned ones for movies. But this one was an original.
The Minnesota Historical Society has one too, but it's not always on display.
Yeah,
The Mormons should have copied them, at least they had the big carts when they all went to the east to Utah. They had carts just like that, there's some pictures.
they're actually, the French had them too,
Yeah.
but usually it wasn't the same because there were two animals pulling it. So there were a different setup at the front. Now this would, it would have, you'd have to have 4 of those sticks coming out the front to hook on your animals. These ones were always just look just like that one.
Derivations like different cars and trucks and stuff.
And I've seen down in the Southwest, they did as well. The people who were Hispanic folk had various carts, but once again, they usually had a spot for two animals. Yes, sir.
Tell us about your book.
My book has not even started yet. It's still in the research stage because every time I think I'm done, it turns out I'm not. Actually, I think I have my core group of people, and I'm writing biographies on the individuals that I have on my list at this point. And I want to take some of the, obviously, the Turpins and the Brunel story would be part of what I would want to do. And there are many stories that I have where we had the Civil War in Minnesota, where some of the Campbells fought for the Dakota, and some were right there at Birch Coulee fighting against their own brothers, literally. So we had a Civil War because those guys had, weirdly enough, right before the Dakota War, 5 regiments were formed, and they were all still in Minnesota in the process of being figured out. And a whole bunch of mixed blood folks, Mentee, had joined these various regiments. The 6th Minnesota Company A had 18 of their 100 were of mixed ancestry. A bunch of them were Dakota. The Felix brothers, somehow they're related, you said, to the Turpins. It's so mind-blowing, these family things. But those boys definitely could speak Dakota, and they knew some of the people who were talking to them and saying, "Come on out, don't go for that." So those stories I find to be gripping as well. But the general story of the Mentee, that's the story that we don't ever hear in Minnesota. I don't know about you guys, but for a couple of years ago, I never heard of all these crazy, fun, interesting people. So there'll be several themes, put it that way.
It'll be a few years, in other words.
God, help me that I live on there. Yes,
I was wondering, is Metis language still used much today, or is it disappearing like other languages?
you know, Mentee has kind of become a status language amongst the very many well-to-do Mentee in Canada, put it that way. Have done just fine. That entrepreneurial spirit came through, and so there is an effort to learn Mentee, and like I said, up at in North Dakota at the reservation, they still teach it
Today. Still
today.
Okay.
I was up, that's why I was so confused. So you aren't Metis, but you're teaching them Mentee. Okay, perfect. Makes sense to me. Why would you teach them Ojibwe if you're Ojibwe? But I knew I wasn't going to win that battle, so.
Well, part of that's the way the US government treats them. As an Ojibwe, they can get benefits.
And I understand
Whereas
it.
the T are not recognized. I mean, I'm not condemning them, they're doing an economic decision
And
to some degree.
it would be the same reason that in one 10-year period, they were Dakota, and the next they were Ojibwe, and then the following one, they were white. You know, whatever was best for that family to do as best they could. They told the story that worked best. And, you know, US government wouldn't recognize the Mentee as a group, and so they were Ojibwe. And here's some Wasichu coming up from Minnesota, and he's gonna talk to them about being Metis. Wasichu is a negative connotation Dakota word for white. Coming up and telling them what's what was not gonna be happening. So they were careful.
I think these sort of are cells that are kind of associated with Metis. Like I know a lot of these indigenous tribes use either weird word or different stuff like that.
Yeah, they're these come from a place, the Cree language, they're called garters. There's a company called La Chisique or something like that. I'd have to look it up. That makes the sashes and the garters, and they are Native peoples. So, and there are also artwork places, and I really would love to get a beaded vest, but they're like $1 million. I mean, a zillion beads that you have to be sewn in there by hand. So I don't expect I'll be getting one of theirs real soon. But yeah, and there's also artists. I've run across different artists that because Mentee is also a group in Canada that is very well recognized as a group, as opposed to here, most people just never heard of it, or like I'll have guys who are arguing sometimes online because one guy is from the Fox tribe, let's say the Meskwake, and one guy is from Canada. And he's saying, well, he's a Mentee. This guy goes, no, he's a Meskwake. The guy's going, no, Mentee. I have to go, hold on. Canadian guy, American guy. Let's talk about this. And it's a general term in Canada for anyone who's of mixed ancestry. But the tribe is also recognized.
Is there any movement to maybe recognize it in America amongst the current groups that are out there? Or is it just, this is what it is and we're staying with it?
I suspect it is what it is.
Yeah.
There's enough other problems in the world on the reservation, I would think, that's not at the top of their list typically that I would imagine. I don't know, because I couldn't even get people to say that they were, their great grandpa Azur was Mentee, when all the Azurs are Mentee, but that's okay. I wasn't gonna argue with them. So I know. All right,
Any other questions?
I
All right.
surely do appreciate it.
Thank you guys for coming. If you want to see what other events we have coming up, we have a little flyer at the front desk.
Emily.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Emily.
Oh, hi. It's so good to see you. Sorry, I just like kind of popped down and